All right, so these are going to be the practice AP questions for Effects of Government Intervention Part 2, or more specifically, excise taxes. So let's get started. So this first question shows a graph of the regular supply and demand and then an excise tax, right, that was implemented. And basically this is asking us, well, where is consumer, where is producer surplus, and where is deadweight loss here? After the imposition, right, of the tax, right? After the imposition of the tax here. So in red, let's do the consumer surplus. So here we know right here, right, is going to be our new equilibrium price for consumers. How do we know that? Well, here, this is the supply curve after the tax, and where the new supply curve intersects with the demand curve, which is right here, represents, right, the new price and the new quantity. So anything above the price and below the demand curve, so this red right here, represents our consumer surplus. So A is our consumer surplus here with the imposition of the tax. So C, D, and E are automatically incorrect here. Well, where is producer surplus? Well, let's do this in green. So remember, for producer surplus, it's not just immediately down, right? Because with the excise tax, both the consumers and producers pay into the tax itself. So we have to go to the new equilibrium, go down to the old supply curve, and just go across. So P1, right, represents the price that sellers are now receiving for selling their good. And our producer surplus is anything below the price and above the supply curve. So this green right here is going to be our producer surplus. So our producer surplus is G. We said our consumer surplus is A. So right now, right, we know that A is the correct answer. But let's see the deadweight loss here. And so remember, deadweight loss is just where the inefficiency is. And there is deadweight loss when we're not maximizing our consumer and producer surplus. And if we are maximizing our consumer and producer surplus, we will be out here. And remember, deadweight loss is always a triangle. So our deadweight loss, right, is right here in blue. So our deadweight loss is D and E, which leaves only one answer choice, right, which is answer choice A. All right, so for number 19, according to the diagram, what is the dollar amount of the unit tax? Well, here, what a lot of you are going to be tempted by is just go from the original equilibrium to $10, right, and just go up to this new equilibrium, $10.45, and say 45 cents. Well, that is incorrect. Right? Because here, remember, it's at every point along the original supply curve, right? And it's just up. So at every point where it's up, that tells us, right, how much this excise tax is. So we could look at two places. We could look at this original equilibrium, right? Let's erase all these extra drawings that I did. So we could look at this original equilibrium, right, which we said was $10, and at this new supply curve is 11. So 11 minus 10 equals $1. So the correct answer is D as in dog, $1, right? We could have also looked at the new equilibrium, right? We could have looked at 10.45, gone down to the original supply curve, right? And see it's 9.45. So that's still a dollar difference. All right. So the last multiple choice, right, is saying, suppose that the market supply curve for shoes is upward sloping and the market demand curve is downward sloping. How will the imposition of a sales tax on shoes affect the consumer surplus, the producer surplus, and the total surplus here? So in other words, when there is an excise tax, how does it affect our consumer, producer, and total surplus here? So conceptually, or if you just think about it, it can get a little tough. However, right, it's a lot more simple if we just draw it out. So we have our price, our quantity, our supply, our demand. And then here, right, our quantity equilibrium, and then our price equilibrium. And so originally, right, our consumer surplus is going to be this yellow highlight right here. And then our producer surplus, right, is going to be this blue right here. So that's both our consumer and producer surplus, and those two added together gets us to our total surplus. But here, right, if we add in the excise tax, right, so it's always going to shift. And then this is our new quantity, and this is our new price. And then this right here, right, represents the price for the sellers. And so here in red, right, this triangle up here represents our consumer surplus. This right here represents our producer surplus. And then this area in between, right, this purple rectangle, right, is going to be the tax revenue. And then obviously in blue, this triangle is our deadweight loss. Well, what happened to our consumer and producer surplus? Well, both of them decreased, right? Because here we have the purple, right? We have this purple right here, tax revenue, that cuts into the consumer and producer surplus. Also, because there was a government intervention with the implementation of the tax, right, there was deadweight loss. So we're not maximizing consumer and producer surplus like we were before the tax itself. So both consumer and producer surplus should be decreasing here, right? So we can knock off the ones that say consumer surplus increases, right, like this right here. We can also knock off the ones that say producer surplus increases, like over here, which only leaves A as the correct answer. And A is just basically saying everything decreased, which is correct, right? Because remember, total surplus is just consumer plus producer surplus. All right, so the last question is going to be an FRQ. So for this FRQ, let's read the initial sort of question here. Assume that gasoline is sold in a competitive market in which demand is relatively inelastic and supply is relatively elastic. So I wonder if you guys got that. Demand is relatively inelastic and supply is relatively elastic. Where a lot of students tend to go wrong with this question is they just jump in and just draw a supply and demand graph. However, if you read this initial prompt, it's saying our demand curve is relatively inelastic. Okay, so here, when part A, when it's just asking us to draw the correctly labeled graph, we have to make sure our demand curve is relatively inelastic, or else you're not going to get the point. So we have our upward sloping supply curve, and then our relatively inelastic demand curve. And then what's this asking us? To label everything QE and PE. So if you just did that, you got a point. Part B, right, is asking us to add on to it, right? So let's say the government imposes a $2 per unit tax on the production of gasoline. Well, it doesn't matter the dollar amount here because it's not asking us to calculate. It's just asking us to label the price paid by buyers, the price received by sellers, and the quantity. So here, right, let's just shift our supply curve up or to the left because it decreased, right? And so here, right, where the new equilibrium is, right, where the new supply curve meets the original demand curve is going to get us to our quantity. That new equilibrium also indicates the price received by buyers, which is PB. Right? And so to get to the after-tax price received by sellers, remember, we have to go to the new equilibrium, go down to the original supply curve, and then we get the price received by sellers there. Right? All right, so part C, which yet again, it's a typo, so I know it says part A, but part C asks us, well, explain how to calculate the total tax revenue. Well, remember, right, if this right here, if PB represents the price that buyers have to pay, or the price that consumers have to pay for the good with the tax, and PS represents the price received by sellers because of the tax, right, this area, right, in red represents the tax revenue. And so all this question is asking us is, without numbers and just using the labeling on the graph, how do we calculate the area of this box? And so this is actually pretty simple, right? Because the area of the box is just length times width. We just have to get to here and multiply it by here. So how do we get that? Well, we get that by just, and there's multiple ways you can do it, but for me, how we got there was I just did PB minus PS, which is this portion right here. And then I did this portion next, times P times PS QT minus PS. Sorry, I ran out of room there. Let's rewrite that to make it a little bit more simple, right? Then I did times QT minus PS to get to the base here. And so that right there would get you the point. Of course, there are other different ways you can manipulate the equation to also get the point, but for me, this was the easiest way. And so our last thing is, will the tax burden fall entirely on buyers, entirely on sellers, more on buyers and less on sellers, or more on sellers and less on buyers, or equally on buyers and sellers, and explain? Well, here, right, let's just draw this out real quick again, right? So we had our supply curve, we had our demand curve, right? This is our price equilibrium, quantity equilibrium. And then we had the imposition of the sales of the excise tax, right? And so if you notice, right, this right here, this purple box represents the area of the tax revenue. In blue, right, represents the area, right, that consumers are paying or buyers are paying. And in green, right, represents the area that producers are paying. So just based on this graph, where does the tax burden ultimately lie? Well, the tax burden ultimately lies more on buyers and less on sellers. And it asks us to explain, right? It says explain. So we have to explain with our words why that is so, right? Because, right, our demand curve is relatively inelastic, right? And that's a good enough explanation. All right, so that's it for today. I hope you guys learned a lot. If you guys still have questions, feel free to send me a message through Remind or contact me via email. I'll be more than happy to go over any one of these questions with you. All right, guys, I hope you learned a lot. Peace.